Hello, Econ students. Today we're going to do notes 5.2 on fiscal policy. Your essential question: what is fiscal policy and how does it affect the economy? We're going to be learning about fiscal policy, how it relates to the federal budget. So, what is fiscal policy? Fiscal policy is the federal government's use of taxing and spending to keep the economy stable. So, it's all the money that comes into the government from all of our tax dollars and then how we spend that money, what the government decides to do with it. So how the government spends the money is known as the federal budget. This is the amount of money that the government expects to receive from a certain year for tax dollars, and then what they can spend that money on. A fiscal year is a 12-month period. It's not necessarily always January through December. It depends on the organization when their fiscal year is. So, for instance, we're all in school, right? We know that a school year pretty much goes from August until June or August until July. That's our fiscal year. So, it doesn't start with the January to December calendar that a normal calendar year would go by. Well, Congress and the White House both work together to develop a federal budget. Remember, the president gets to suggest what they think that the Congress should spend the money on, and they give that expectation in their State of the Union address, and then Congress then writes the budget, passes it to the president. So policies regarding fiscal environments can be both expansionary and contractionary. So, expansionary policies are expanding, so they're fiscal policies that are trying to increase the output. Whereas contractory policies, if they're contracting, they are trying to decrease the output. So, if we're trying to expand our fiscal policy, the government is increasing their government spending. They're trying to raise the output and create jobs. They can also cut taxes to consumers or businesses so they have more money to spend or more money to invest. This can increase demand and output. But if the fiscal policy is contracting, then we have a decrease in government spending. They're trying to slow GDP growth, they can raise taxes, and that can slow the rate of growth. Fiscal policy can be really difficult, as we've seen in 2020 with COVID, trying to pass relief bills, trying to have Congress figure out the financial aspects of COVID. We can have difficulty spending the changing the spending levels. We can have difficulty predicting the future. No one could have anticipated that this year we were going to be dealing with this pandemic that was going to be affecting everyone in the world and the entire economy. We can also have delayed results. So when we have fiscal policies get enacted, sometimes it does take time for them to really make an effect on the economy. And we can have political pressures as well. So, like this year, we had an election, so there's a lot of pressure on our political figures to do something. So, the government has to coordinate fiscal policies with the various branches of government, which can sometimes be difficult to do. So, we have different fiscal policy options, different economic ideas on how we should spend our money. So we have the classical ideas, the idea of the invisible hand. Adam Smith, remember, the father of economics, he believes that markets will regulate themselves. So we should take that laissez faire approach. The government should kind of stay out of things and let the market self regulate. We have different economic ideas coming from David Ricardo, Thomas Malthus. They're all considered classical economics, and they really believe that we should keep the government out of economic policy. A lot of that changed in 1929 when we had the Great Depression. Keeping the government out didn't necessarily help, so many people believe the government was required to and needed to step in and help out Americans during that struggling time. Keynesian economics, the economic idea that the economy is composed of three sectors: individuals, businesses, and the government. So the government has to be involved to make actions for the other two. Keynesian economists argue that fiscal policy can be used to fight a recession and depressions and can also fight inflation. A stable economy is one in which there are no rapid changes in economic factors. So things are pretty stable, pretty smooth, and the government can enact economic stabilizers. So stabilizers are government taxes or changes in responses to the GDP or to income to try to stabilize things. Another popular economic theory is supply side economics. You may have learned about this in your US history class. Ronald Reagan was a really big fan of supply side economics or trickle down economics, or it became known as Reaganomics as well. So, this was the idea that if you cut taxes on the wealthy, it will trickle down to everybody else in a society. And this is something that we did in the United States for fiscal policy in the 1980s. And as we saw when we did this, when you cut taxes on the wealthy, it made the wealthy much wealthier, but it didn't actually end up trickling down to everybody else. But it's still something that we practice in the United States today. Various times throughout US history, you have learned about fiscal policy, whether you realized it or not. So, of course, when we had the Great Depression, FDR got elected, we had all of those New Deal programs, all of that fiscal policy. World War II increased government spending as we geared up for the war. 1960s, we had more government spending because of the Vietnam War. And then in the 1980s, Ronald Reagan cut taxes for the highest incomes in our society. Budget deficits and the national debt. A balanced budget is a budget which revenues are equal to spending. So the government is trying to always get to a balanced budget. In our next unit, we're going to get into personal finance, and you all are going to learn about how to balance your own budget. So we're going to look at your first year of independence, how to balance your income from your job with all your expenditures. The government has to do this every single year. So they have to balance the budget. Budget surpluses are when they have more revenue, so more tax dollars, than their expenditures. So they have more money than they are spending. So this happened in the Clinton administration. We actually had President Clinton and his Vice President Al Gore. We had a balanced budget, and then we started to have an increase in our revenue. So we had a surplus. We had more money than we needed. And then deficits are what we've had for the majority of the time. Deficits occur when expenditures exceed our revenue. So when we owe more money, we have more bills than we're able to pay for with our money, with our income, with our tax dollars. So how do governments respond to budget deficits? Well, they can create more money, but creating more money increases demand for goods and services, and that can lead to inflation. So if they just print more money, then that money is going to be worth less. We can also borrow money. This is something that we do. We can borrow money from American citizens by selling bonds. It's popular during wartime to do that. We also can borrow money from other countries. So the deficit is the amount of money the government owes for one fiscal year. But the debt is all of the money that we owe, overall, the entire amount that we owe. So the deficit is just for one fiscal year, the debt is everything. Our debt is extremely large in the United States. It's over $19 trillion. The national debt is the total amount of money that the federal government owes. And as you can see in the bottom right corner there, the majority of the money that we owe is to China. The majority of the outside money that we owe. So we borrow a lot of money here in the United States, bonds, things like that. But China has loaned us 47% of our debt there. So is debt a problem for our country? So some people would argue that our national debt is a massive problem, but some people would argue that it's something that we've been living with, so it's not that big of a deal. Dollars spent paying interest on our debt cannot be spent on anything else, so we can't use that money to pay for other things taxes could pay for, like defense, education, healthcare. So some people would argue that it's a very negative thing that we have. People have tried to limit the amount of deficit or debt that we have. Some people argue that we need to balance our budget every single year to make the government more disciplined about what they're spending their money on. But opponents say if we do that, it's not flexible enough to deal with the rapid changes in the economy. So, like this year, if we had to have an exact budget, if we couldn't borrow any money or go into any debt, we would have had a very hard time passing any relief bills for COVID. So, people having more unemployment, giving that extra stimulus to everyone in the nation, things like that. The Federal Reserve System is our banking system in the United States. So we've been having a Federal Reserve System way back since our founding fathers, since the 1700s. We had Thomas Jefferson, Alexander Hamilton debating on how our banking system should be run. It wasn't until the early 1900s that we really developed a full federal banking system across the nation. So we have a Federal Reserve System, which is 12 independent banks. There's 12 different districts that are called the Federal Reserve Districts. You can see our district right here is called San Francisco. We are the 12th district. It's pretty much the entire West Coast, Alaska, and Hawaii. There are 7 members that run the Board of Governors, and they are able to take actions for the Federal Reserve and handle our monetary policy. About 40% of all banks in the United States belong to the Federal Reserve. So what does the Federal Reserve do? Well, the Federal Reserve, or it's sometimes known as the Fed, they maintain the checking account for the United States government. So the checking account for the Treasury Department, they process payments such as Social Security payments or IRS refunds. So when you do your taxes each year, you'll get a check back from the IRS. When you retire, you'll get Social Security checks. Those are all coming from the Treasury Department. They also handle bonds, and the Federal Reserve banks are responsible for issuing our paper currency. The Department of the Treasury handles the coins. So they have serving banks. So the banks within the Fed, they do check clearing. So banks record who gives money, who receives the money through our checking system. They supervise lending practices, and they're a lender of last resort. So banks can borrow money from the Federal Reserve if they need to. I'm going to teach you all about how to write a check in our next unit on personal finance. And I know you may not ever have to do that, but some places where you pay rent, you will still have to write a check. So I just want you to know how to do it just in case you ever have to pay with a check. So I'm going to teach you how to do that. But you write a check, it goes to the recipient. The recipient then takes it to their bank. They give it to the Federal Reserve Bank. They go back, and then it goes through. So your check can be returned to you if you would like. Most people don't get their checks returned to them, but it's pretty much a long way of using your debit card. The Fed coordinates all banking activities, so they regulate the banking system as well. So they have to deal with reserves, so that's how much money that they're actually controlling, how much money they have on hold, on reserve at any time. And they also deal with bank examinations, so they make sure that banks are following the laws, following the regulations, things like that. The Fed's also responsible for regulating the money supply. So they determine how much money that we have in circulation across the United States. Factors that can affect demand for money is the cash that people need on hand. So right now, that's probably lower because not many people are using cash. In fact, a lot of places are saying because of COVID, they don't want to use cash. Interest rates, price levels, and the general level of income. The Fed is also responsible for trying to stabilize the economy, keep those inflation rates stable. Tools of monetary policy. Money creation is the process by which money enters into circulation. So they have to decide how much money we are going to print each year, how much money is going to be in circulation, and when money needs to come out of circulation. So there's actually a calculation and a process for creating money, and the Federal Reserve gets to determine that. So the Fed has three tools available to adjust the money supply in the nation. The first tool is adjusting the required reserve ratio. So they can change how much is required for banks and people to have on hand, how much money is out there in the economy, how much currency, I should say. That also deals with the discount rate. The discount rate is the interest rate that banks pay to borrow money from the Fed. They can increase or decrease this rate. So, increasing the discount rate causes banks to lend out less money, which leads to a decrease in the money supply. And the Fed deals with open market operations. And this is the buying and selling of government securities to alter the money supply. So, these are the things like you learned about in your history classes selling bonds, war bonds, treasury bonds, things like that, so that the government can have more money in the money supply. And monetary policy and macroeconomic stabilization. Monetarism is the belief that the money supply is the most important factor in the macroeconomic performance. So, some people believe that how much money we actually have is the most important way to look at our economy and to determine the health of our economy. It's all about timing. So we know the business cycle generally runs on about a 6 year cycle. So we have to have good timing, which can minimize inflation. But bad timing can actually make a business cycle worse. So it can make those recessions much worse, much longer. So we got to make sure that we have good timing. And then, of course, those policy lags, like we talked about earlier, they can take time. There can be lags between when policy is enacted and when it finally actually starts appearing that's making a difference in the economy. So the Federal Reserve has to not only pay attention to what's happening in the economy, they have to try to anticipate any changes that are going to happen in the economy, which is sometimes pretty hard to do. But the Fed has to pay attention to all of these things in order to maintain the nation's economy so they can determine whether they need to expand or contract the economy, depending on how we're doing and where we are in the business cycle. All right, everyone, and that's the end of your notes for today. So don't forget to write a summary, a couple sentences about what you learned.